15th chapter can actually be considered as another of the summary chapters of the Bhagavad-Gita. There are three such chapters. The second chapter, which is an introductory curtain raiser, which gives you an overview of the Bhagavad-Gita. And thereafter, 15th was initially considered as the last of the chapters and therefore was a functional summary of the whole of Bhagavad-Gita. 15th chapter thus is a functional summary. And then later a couple of other chapters are also added to elaborate on the knowledge aspects of the Jana segment. And the 16th and 17th chapters were added, and finally the 18th chapter. The 18th chapter is a technical summary. It is a detailed technical summary or the knowledge-based summary of the whole of Bhagavad Gita again. So 15th and 18th form the functional summary and the knowledge-based summary of the scripture of Bhagavad Gita. So today we are going to look at the 15th chapter. The 15th chapter is a very cryptic chapter, just like the 12th chapter, Bhakti Yoga. There are only 20 verses, and these 20 verses of the 15th chapter are a beautiful summary of this functional Bhagavad Gita. So, from a practical point of view, what does Bhagavad Gita teach? That is basically what is the subject matter of the 15th chapter, which is termed as the Purushottama Yoga. So, Purushottama Yoga is talking about how the realization of the perfect personality, in the sense that what is the state of perfection, which is represented by that infinitude and which is present within each one of us as our own Atman, the self. So the perfection is right there within us. That is the essence of the whole of Bhagavad Gita. This tapping of this perfection that is right within us, how do you actually accomplish that? It is not about reaching that perfect state, but it is about your striving to reach that perfection. This is basically what the process of Bhagavad Gita is through karma, bhakti, and jnana yogas. So let's take a look at that. Look at the 20 verses in summary at the beginning itself in our today's session also. We will look at it as take a bird's eye view initially, and then we'll go into some of those details. So I have actually written out here the 20 slokas as one-liners. A practical one-liner about the 20 verses. So here it goes. And I have also put an infographic on the right side. Those of you who can watch that screen can also see. And I will point out some of the essential components of that infographics to match with the description of the 20 slokas. Okay. The first verse and the first, second, third, the first 6 verses actually summarizes the process of life as a tree of life, actually, as a living entity. All of us living as an entity, we are encapsulating the infinite power as a life force within each one of us. We are forced by nature to live a life trying to satisfy the senses, because what is it in living? The mind and the senses. Ego and the desires drive us to satisfy the demand of our senses and the mind. The eye wants to see good things, pleasant things. The ear wants to hear soothing sounds. The tongue wants to taste good things. The nose goes after pleasant smell. And the skin thirsts for sensations that are exciting and pleasing. This is what happens when the power of the self enlivens these senses. Because the mind works along with these senses. We can only escape this drive for pleasures of the mind and the senses by cultivating detachment and reticence. The happiness that we receive through sensory and mind's pleasures are really limited. But the happiness derived from the inner joys of the self, higher goals, are superior and lasting. This is something that we need to understand. So the first 6 verses describe the purpose of actually understanding the wisdom of the Bhagavad-Gita. It goes on to say, why? Why should we seek the joys of the self? So, the joys of the self gives you the pleasure that is eternal and that is everlasting. So, that is the prime reason, and therefore, it is again, Krishna is again explaining that it is this power of self which is available within us as energy of the self or life energy that energizes the senses and the mind. We become the jiva, thus we become the jiva. The senses and the mind trigger thoughts and actions within us. The nature of our thoughts and the senses are exhibited through life pulsing through the BMI. Thus, the BMI starts its enjoyments. We can thus see that the self is the driver within us. Intellect is enabled by the self. Emotions are then enabled by the self. All metabolic activities happen because of the life forces within going through each one of our cells. The self becomes the digestive energies that in turn enables metabolism. Memories are activated, and so too are all the inferencing capabilities resulting in knowledge. Self is thus our true identity. The self can be seen as in two aspects within each one of us. One is the perishable jiva. Self is seen as the perishable jiva within us, and seems to be the enjoyer. But the jiva is because of the Atman, which is imperishable, because that jiva is actually coming up because of the Atman, enlightening us or lighting up our being. But the Atman itself derives from the most supreme, also called as the Ishvara or the perfect one. So, this is basically what happens. If we look at the infographic, we have digestion, power of digestion, creating the metabolic capabilities, then also enlivening our memories and the intellect, and thus giving us the power of knowledge through inference capabilities of the brain. So all this is, how is it happening? That is, the self is empowering the mind, but ego is there, and we become selfish. So we need to cut off this ego, and then you will become like the right one, where selflessness is driving us and resulting in perennial happiness. And the energy per se, if you look at the physical aspects of the energy, the digestion, metabolism, memory, reasoning, knowledge, these are all enlightened by that self, and the self becoming the experiencer within us, which is the jiva. And really, if you look at it, that experiencer is nothing but the jiva, the self, the Atman. This is the Guhyadamam Shastram, that is the most precious, most secret science of perfection. So you can, this is in simple 20 lines. The 15th chapter has now summarized the whole Bhagavad-Gita as the inner self actually empowering our ego and the mind, and if we are able to shape our destiny through the minimization of the ego, then the qualities of the mind that actually goes through would be not selfish qualities, but the yajna tyaga samarpana prasada bhavas. That is what I have written as the YTSP bhava. So if you want to bring out the self in the form of yajna tyaga samarpana prasada bhavas, then the ego has to be sublimated. If the ego is not sublimated, then that qualities of the mind which is contaminated by ego is basically what will be exhibited by our intellect, mind, and the body. The moment we are able to cut off the ego, selfishness, then the self will shine through all our thoughts and actions, resulting in yajna, tyaga, samarpana, prasada, bhavas, karma yogi. We become a karma yogi who is working towards the upliftment of the environment, of the societies, and all those things. In the sense of we bring in a synergy of power, which is rooted in coexistence and expansion. And coexistence and expansion is a direct reflection of Brahman. Yajnam, Brahman, Yajne Pratishthitam. So, coexistence and expansion, which is the practical aspects of Yajna Tyaga Samarpana Bhava within us, is the true reflection of Brahman. And that will see through in all our thoughts and actions. This is basically what. So, the solution for our problems would be the sublimation of ego in the terms of selfishness has to be thrown out, and we have to exist in a selfless manner, exhibiting these characteristics of coexistence and expansion. So it is a very simple message that the Bhagavad-Gita gives. Very simple in terms of literally understanding it, but then it is a very complex concept that we need to really practice in life. How to practice in life, in the world that we are living in. It is not about running away from it, but it is about, trying to incorporate these value systems in our family, in our society, in our workplaces, etc. So how do you actually do that? We need to look at the nitty-gritty of it, of how to employ these things in everyday living as well as in life. So this is the essence of Purushottama Yoga. This is how you become perfect in the sense of, somebody who will leave behind a lasting legacy of coexistence and expansion, and who would actually be not creating any ripples in the grand scheme of things. So that is the essence. So let's look at a little bit more in detail in some of these aspects. And the most important thing is the practical aspect of it, which is how to actually, what is the process of perfection. 15.5, that is Nirmana Moha, Jitasanka Dosha, Adhyatma Nitya, Vinivrittha Kamaha, Dhandhair Vimuktaha, Sugadukka Satnyai, Gacchandi Abhudaha, Padamavyayam Tap. So pride and delusion, Nirmana Moha, Jitasanka Dosha, disassociated from bad company, Adhyatma Nitya, eternally wedded to conscience, truth. Vinivritta Kamaha, free from selfish desires. Dvandair Vimuktaha, Sugadukka Satnyai. So free from, happiness and sorrow and those duality. Such non-deluded people, Gacchandi Mudaha, Padam Avyayam, such non-deluded, wise people will reach that eternal state of sustainable happiness. That is the state of perfection with that the Purushottama Yoga is talking about. That is what the whole message of Bhagavad-Gita is. And then finally, it also says, these two slokas represent the whole essence of this chapter also. Yasmad aksharam adhidoham aksharaadapi chottamaha atosmi loke vevecha prathita purushottamaha. Because the self, the Atman within each one of us, is beyond the perishable. It is not something that dies with our body. And more perfect than the imperishable. The imperishable Atman within each one of us, we consider each one of the Atman as a kind of spark of the divine. The Atman as a spark of the divine. So it is not the perfection, the Purushottama. It is a spark of the divine, the Atman. So what it says, even the Atman seems to be perishable, because when the Jiva goes, when the body dies, the Jiva does not have any medium. So we do not thereafter see the Atman. It has merged with the infinite. So therefore, the Bhagavad-Gita is talking about three levels. The self, the Jiva, the self, the Atman, and the perfect, Ishvara. So the Jiva, the Atman, and Ishvara. These three levels are talked about in this chapter. So for our easy understanding, we'll look at that in further detail through some of these slokas. Okay. Let us look at the way we exist in this life, in the practical aspects of our living. Our mindsets are shaped by knowledge. But at the same time, the mindset is also contaminated by selflessness or selfishness. I've shown the effects of selfishness on the left side and effects of selflessness on the right side. The mindset and therefore our motivations are shaped by selflessness or selfishness, or a mixture of these things. Nobody can be perfectly selfless. Similarly, nobody can be always only 100% selfish. That also is not possible. So we have a mixture of selfishness and selflessness driving our motivations, created by our mindset. The selfishness within us is also graded. The selfishness is affecting our gross intellect, mind, and the senses. So, which is about sattva, sattvic rajas, rajas, tamasic rajas, and tamas in various quantities. Selfishness is driven more by ignorance of the truth. So this is basically what we saw in the 14th chapter. The 14th chapter is placed just before the 15th because 14th chapter summarizes how all our minds are contaminated or can be controlled, fine-tuned like the Veena that we talked about. So, sattva, sattvic rajas, rajas, tamasic rajas or tamas, any of these kind of combinations it can be. Whereas, and you will find that there is more of tamas and tamasic rajas and rajas than sattva and sattvic rajas in a selfish mind. Whereas on the selfless mind side, you will find a reverse order of things where the tamas is reduced, tamasic rajas is reduced, but still it is driven by rajas, but more of sattvic rajas and sattva. Because in living in this world, you need to have rajas. Without rajas, you will not be a living entity. Zero rajas means you are doing nothing. So this is how our intellect, mind, and the senses are controlled by the nature, sattva, rajas, and tamo. When it is controlled more by selfishness, we actually are driven by our gross intellect. But when we are driven by the higher wisdom, sattva and sattvic rajas, then it is the subtle intellect that is driving us, controlling us. If selflessness is driving us, then our attitudes and aptitudes, create a better world. Whereas if selfishness is ruling us, our attitudes and aptitudes that result, which we have been talking about in Karma Yoga, then the world we create will be accordingly according to our selfishness. This is how the tree of our life is actually working. And this has been picturized in the chapter 15 at the beginning. What we can see is that the power of the self flows through the senses and make us enjoy the objects of the world. This is what the first part of the 15th chapter is talking about, and it is actually controlled by these sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic qualities. By cutting the ego, therefore, cutting out selfishness, by detachment, we can reach the power of the self, which is about, living in this world in a manner that is yajna-driven, sacrifice-driven. This is the world we create. When cooperation, sacrifice, dedication, and abundance are applied in the pursuit of creative excellence, protective abundance, expansive enrichment, and dexterity of skills. The development of these things, when you are driven by this yajna spirit, yajna tyaga samarpana prasada bhavas, in creativity, innovation, and in enrichment, and in the cultivation of our capabilities, skill sets, etc., they open up a world of immense possibilities for uniformity and unification. But when these sets are driven more by values of selfishness, aggrandizement, taking up things for yourself, power and conceit, when you are driven by that in the pursuit of the same creativity, productivity, expansion, and skills, they too open up a world of possibilities, but then it is contaminated by diversity and division. So you can see in our world, we see all the diversities and division because of selfishness ruling the mindsets of people. This is basically what is analogically presented as an inverted tree, with the roots of that tree forming the knowledge that drives the mindset and helps the tree to grow and then spread into the world. But it is depicted as a downward thing because of the senses and the pleasures driving people down to valuelessness in society is shown as a downward spiraling. So it is Urdamula Vatashagam, Ashwatam Prakuraviyam, Chandamsi Yasya Varnani, Yastam Veda Savedavit. So this tree with the roots at the top is growing downward and spreading out into this world and binding us down through the senses. That's basically what is picturized there. That mindset is that trunk of the tree, which is about creativity, productivity, and enrichment. Now, how do you use creativity, productivity, and enrichment? That is basically what is picturized by the branches that is growing upward and downward, etc. Upward, it grows when it is selfless. Downward is the flow that it goes down when it is a selfish-oriented mindset. The knowledge that is of the work that we do, etc., results in our attitudes and aptitudes, which is represented by the leaves of the tree and the fruits there. So we have wisdom or ego driving us in this world. If it is ego that is driving us, which is a lack mindset, which is a deficient mindset, that actually results in destruction, consumption, and degradation. Whereas a wisdom-oriented, higher values-oriented motivations, attitudes, and aptitudes will help us to be selfless and therefore to be creative, productive, and enriching in the lasting sense. So the results of action downward for selfishness and the results of action going upward for selflessness. The Uttarayana, selflessness, and Dakshinayana, selfishness driving us is basically what the picturization of the initial 6 to 8 slokas of the 15th chapter lyric. This is how we live in this, all jivas are living in this form. Now it is our purpose in life to be tapping the selflessness, yajna spirit, and driving the society, driving the communities, driving the family, etc., upward towards knowledge, towards wisdom. By cutting away selfishness by using the acts of detachment to reach that eternal state represented by Brahman, the infinitude, which is yajna spirit. So if we are able to think, if we are able to exist in a reflective state in every walk of our life, thinking about the higher value of sacrifice, then that means we have reached that state of perfection. We are reaching that actual the state of Brahma. So how do we actually do that? Practically, that is what we have seen it at depth in the Karma Yoga. To how do you use Yajna Bhava in workplaces? How do you use Yajna Bhava in family, etc.? So we focused more on the workplace strategies because that's something that we need to actually apply these things. If you want to apply profession in the professions, in workplace, etc., the essence of Bhagavad-Gita, then we need to actually apply these value systems, the essence of wisdom, into strategies that we can apply at the workplaces. That is what we saw in Karma Yoga. So this is the essence of the wisdom of Bhagavad-Gita. Why do you actually have to understand the Bhagavad-Gita is because we need to understand what the self is. The self which is within each one of us, actually beaming within us as the life force. And we need to use that through our mind and intellect and the senses. We cannot do anything without our mind intellect, isn't it? Without our mind and intellect, we are nothing in the physical world. Without our mind and intellect, actually speaking, we are infinite. But then, if we are living in this world as a living being, then we need to bring about the infinitude through our mind. Otherwise, we become limited. That is what Bhagavad-Gita is teaching us. To bring about the infinitude through your mind. How do you do that? You can do that only through coexistence and expansion. Yajna. And that Yajna changes your mindset. Completely changes your mindset by killing the ego, helping you to kill the ego and therefore develop your attitudes, and aptitudes so that you can become creative, productive, enriching, and dexterous. And thus serve society using your supreme motivations to grow this tree. But yet, these branches of that tree growing upward towards the root. The branches of the tree growing towards the root is the ultimate aim. To become the knowledge of the self and the wisdom of the self in all your thoughts and actions is the ultimate aim. So that the trees, all the branches of the tree grows upward. This can only be achieved through this process of nirmana moha, jitasanka dosha, adhyatma nitya, vinivritta kama, dhantairvi mukta, sukadukka sajnai, gacchandi, amudaha, padamabhyantat. So you will reach that state. A state of happiness which cannot be compared to any kind of happiness that you can derive from your body, mind, and intellect or selfishness. Selfishness can also bring you certain fleeting happiness, pleasures, momentary pleasures, etc. But later it will go down and then create more unhappiness. But whereas if you are driven by this yajna spirit, driven by infinitude, driven by the self, the joys of the self, then you will reach a state, the happiness of which cannot be compared to anything else. That is now being explained. The self, if you are focused on the self, your initial consciousness now being powered by that self, you become, the self is now trapped within your consciousness and you become conscious, and your consciousness is the true representation of the self at that point in time. From then onwards, it actually starts kicking your life as what is called as prajna, the state of prajna which is described in the Mandukya Upanishad. That prajna state is the pure form of consciousness within each one of us, which is not deviated by any thoughts or actions. So it is not differentiated. The undifferentiated consciousness that is first starting to kick within our human brains initially when a separate life form, we become a separate life form. That undifferentiated consciousness is what the infinite is. And then what happens is, it gets connected to the senses and therefore the consciousness gets differentiated. So we have different types of, it is attached to senses. We have the hearing consciousness, the seeing consciousness, the vision consciousness, the smell consciousness, the taste consciousness, the touch consciousness, etc. All these things come out, which means that in undifferentiated single stream of consciousness has now been split open into threads. And each one of them starts pursuing things. And to collectively use all these things to control and then to use these things, there is another software that gets formed, which is called as the mind. And that mind now takes control of all these things, but is driven by the senses. The mind. And the intellect thus gets controlled by this differentiated consciousness, the differentiation happening because of the sensory interaction with the outside world. And it actually starts exhibiting through our bodies and the senses. It is equated to the sun, moon, and the fire. So you can actually derive happiness of intellect, the happiness of the mind, and the happiness of the body and the senses. But they are all not lasting. just like the fire, it burns out everything ultimately. The self is forgotten, completely forgotten. At this stage, we do not think that I am the self. We start thinking that I am the intellect, I am the mind, and I am the body. But we have to understand that the happiness of the senses, the mind, and the intellect that you derive is nothing compared to the happiness of the joys of the self. That is what it is declared here. The Bhagavad-Gita's essence is declared like as the joys of the self, the happiness derived from the joys of the self is the most supreme happiness that you can experience in this life, in this life. Na tat pasayate suryaha, na shashankaha, na pavaha, yat gatvana nivartante, tat dhama paramamava. So it is now being declared that the happiness, the happiness that you get from the self is having a glow that cannot be compared to the glow of neither the sun, the moon, or the fire. It is an analogical depiction of that process, beautifully described in terms of three physical entities that we see. In fact, the whole of Upanishads in different Vedas, you can see the same analogy being used. The sun, moon, and the fire. The three things: the sun, intellectual; moon, the mind, mental; and fire, physical. These are three representations of life, limited lights. The consciousness derived, the prajna that is derived from that Brahman is the pure light that we all have trapped within us, but then being taken away and shredded into different directions by the senses and the mind. And you should also understand that Mamevamsho Jivaloke, Jiva Bhuda Sanadanaha, Manashashtani Indriyani Prahyudistani Kashami. So that infinite is now getting trapped within this BMI, and every aspect of our BMI is now engulfed and entrenched within this, with the power of that self. In all living beings, it is like that. And then that power enlivens the mind and the senses and get entangled with it. And this mind and the senses actually start driving our mind. Now, because ultimately it is the mind that is making us work in this world. And then what happens? Then this power of the self enlivens our senses and the motor control and the mental aspects, intellectual aspects. It comes out as a different power, which is the power of thoughts. So self, the power, infinite power, comes and energizes your mind and intellect and comes out as the intellectual power, the emotional power, and the physical power. Three things. It comes out. The self comes out from within each one of us as intellectual power, mental power, and sensual power. In three different ways, but then and combining them together, it comes out as the way we act and think, the way we act in this world. The power of the self. I know in scientific terms, how does this work? It works like this. The power of the self is actually empowering the cortical areas of our brain, activating the cortical algorithms within our brain, and it actually goes out from within each one of our mind as the powers of perception, thought, and action. So that transformation is something that you should always be appreciating, and to understand how the power of the self is finally exhibiting differently in different people. And therefore, we are able to look at different people in the right perspective and is able to be accommodative, collaborating, compassionate, etc. So, Yajna Tyaga Samarpana Prasada Bhavas automatically start building within our brain when we actually start understanding the power that is driving each one of us, every one of us as no different, but the difference coming from the minds the nature of our mind. It's like the power of the self, which is the motive power, energizing our mind with emotions and thoughts, and then coming out as acts of emotion or acts of those intellectual ideas. The power of self, we don't see the power of self now. The power of self is now wrapped up with our emotions and personal ideas, selfish ideas, and then it comes out. The power of self comes out as acts of emotion. When the mind is full of, rajas and rajasic. Meera has raised the hand. Anything? Sorry.
Sir, I was just wondering if consciousness is energizing the mind and the intellect and the senses. Can we say mind as the byproduct of consciousness?
It is
Or is it actually a mind that is the byproduct of
it is
the
not.
consciousness?
It is actually well. If you when you talk about byproduct, there are various other aspects to it. But just look at it this way. If you want to think of it as a byproduct, that is also fine because we have the hardware. We have the hardware, which is our combinations of all our neuronal cells and biological cells. The normal biological cells which create the living entity, and then there is this neuronal millions and billions of neurons that are trapping the energy within each one of us, the energy that we derive from the outside world. And when that energy from the outside, the universal energy, you can call it as the universal forces of nature, when they start pulsating within our neurons, a combination of millions of neurons coming together to create what is called as a byproduct, which is consciousness. Actually, first byproduct is consciousness because of the forces of nature working through our brain. The first byproduct is consciousness.
Okay.
And now that consciousness is what actually starts becoming specialized and creates what is called as thoughts within each one of us. And that is our mind. The flow of such thoughts is what is called as our mind. Therefore, yes. So thoughts of mind is the byproduct of that consciousness. So you can see that chain of transformations that are taking place from the forces of nature. The forces of nature is basically what we all are. But we become specialized through the conscious energy. The conscious energy initially is pure, without getting in contact with any of the senses for every one of us, human beings. That conscious, that is what is called as prajna. So we'll call it as prajna. When we say consciousness, in scientific form, that the consciousness is tied to all the senses and all those things. So that term consciousness, when you talk to a scientific circle, it means something. Whereas what we are talking about is consciousness initially in pure form, which has got a Sanskrit word that was introduced by our rishis and all, which is called as prajna. So prajna is what, but that prajna is not the term that is used in the outside in a scientific community and all, because that is a Sanskrit word. So they have come up with the word consciousness. But then consciousness is truly the word consciousness, which is there in science, is not prajna. It is much more, it is more of a contaminated version of prajna that is called as consciousness. So that is the reason I always actually keep telling that we use consciousness in a very loose manner in spiritual circles. The word that we should be using is prajna, and that prajna is same in every one of us. It is
so prajna and atman is the same, one and the same.
Prajna and atman is actually you can probably call something that atman is the prajna is the nearest form that you can call it as atman, nearest to atman in the sense of that term, which is the power giver, enlivener for each one of us. So that prajna, that is actually prajna, and in some ways you can call it prajna is equal to atman. I wouldn't say that it is it is wrong, but at the same time it may not be 100% correct, but it is more and more close to the truth. But then consciousness, when it becomes consciousness, it is tied to all kinds of apparatus that is giving us awareness of the physical world. Whereas prajna is merely a window. It is not creating any awareness. It is merely a window through which, we can actually extract knowledge from the outside world. But for that, we need devices. And that is the senses, the mind and the senses. Those devices, without the mind and senses, we cannot derive this knowledge. For this particular individual, for each one of us, personal, individual, that is the jiva. Jiva is dependent on the senses and the mind and the qualities of that mind to actually interpret the outside world and gather knowledge, as well as to abstract that knowledge ultimately and even remove the ego and all those things. The mind is required such that we actually rise the levels and reach to that highest state of what you call as yajna bhava. That is what Bhagavad-Gita is teaching us. Okay. So, Meera, did I answer your question? Okay, so
I'm trying to understand it, sir.
okay. So you have to actually reflect on this, and then you will start seeing that. Maybe we
Yes,
can discuss at the end.
Yes, sir.
So basically, think over it as we, still further, when we are going down to the next few of the verses, these things will become more and more clear. So when the mind is pure, when the mind is now uncontaminated by the rajas and tamas, etc., and is driven by the absolute faith that I am the self, and that my purpose in living is to tap the power of the self. What is the power of the self? Coexistence and expansion, yajna bhava. So if I am motivated purely by yajna bhava in all my thoughts and therefore my actions, I am exhibiting joys of the self in the outside world. So we still do not see the power of the self as it is, the power of self going on. We see the joys of the self as playing out. Joys of the self in terms of, how we actually contribute to the living in the best manner possible and deriving happiness out of it. So this is how we work. And how does this happen? That is what is described in the sloka as Shariram yadhavapnodi yachapit kramadisharaha vihitaitvani samyadi vayurgandha nivashayat. Like it is like this, as the air which passes through the flower comes out as scented air, carrying the fragrance of the flower. Like that, the power of the self, the infinitude, air, infinitude, the infinite energy, now coming through us, each one of us as universal energies, getting contaminated by the mind, intellect, senses, etc., the nature, the gunas of the mind, comes out as the scented air. The fragrance of my mind is what I am exhibiting. I, the flower, will exhibit the fragrance of this flower only. The self goes through this. If I am jasmine, then what I leave behind will be the smell of jasmine. That is how it is picturized, and this is a very good analogy for us to imagine how that power of the self is working through me, and therefore how I can control the fragrance that I leave behind. The fragrance of yajna bhava is to be left behind, is the essence of the Bhagavad-Gita. Instead, what we normally do is we think that we are the BMI, the senses, ear, skin, tongue, eye, nose, and jnanendriyas, here, touch, taste, see, smell, all contaminated by the, our mind, gunas of the mind, and the manasa, buddhi, chitta, and the ahangaram, all, flushed with this, and we come out, and I keep saying, I am the jiva, the specific jiva. So for identity's sake, in this world, we give names. And so I say, I am Satish. In reality, I am not Satish. I am not Satish. This BMI is Satish. What am I? I am this. I am self. The BMI is merely the equipment through which the self is expressing. I the self expressing through the BMI. This is the essence. This is the essence. If we can picture this, instead of this, I am this. Instead of this, I am this. That is basically what we need. We need to actually encapsulate this knowledge through what you call as ultimate faith. We need to have Sharanagati. That is what is called as Sharanagati. That is, I am completely surrendering to that knowledge that I am the self and not the BMI, is what is called as Sharanagati. When we achieve Sharanagati, then all your thoughts will become Yajnabhavas. And you will always be coexisting with a sustainable expansion plan. So, in practical terms, how do you actually apply this in organizations? We need to understand the self of the organization for that matter. What is the purpose of the organization? What is the context and the purpose for which the organization stands? And if you are able to identify completely with the purpose, context of the organization, then you are achieving what you call as the rapport, the synchronization with the organization, and become one with the organization, and your growth is sustained in such organizations. In the sense, if you have such attitudes to work, you will sustain growth in that organization. That is a practical thing that we need to learn. How do you achieve this perfection in that organization? In the working world, you need to identify with the self of the organization. Yourself and the self. Yourself and the organization self becomes the self. That is when you become a key player in the organization. That is when you actually maximize your potential. That is what Karma Yoga was talking about. Your thoughts drive your actions. And who are you? I am the infinite. I everywhere. I am everywhere. But currently, in the physical frame that I think I am, I exhibit as my thoughts, and that thoughts come out as actions. This is what I am. Can you meditate on this infographic, the pulsating infographic? And this is what is happening. If you are able to think about this, reflect on this, then you will start feeling this infinitude pulsating through us. And then you will actually start looking at ways and means of making sure that this I is reflected in all your actions, which is about identifying with this higher causes, identifying with the root wisdom, instead of tying yourself down to selfishness, your own interests, selfishness, senses, your own interests, etc., and branching downward and only being protected by selfish knowledge. But instead, you need to branch upward and be protected by the Yajnatyagas, Samarpana Prasada Bhavas, knowledge which are structured and structurally strengthened by Yajnatyaga Samarpana Prasada Bhavas. Then you will start growing upward towards that wisdom. So this is it. Each one of us is like this. This picture here, the pulsating picture here, is each one of us. The self, I, who am I? I am the infinite. But I am now currently this Jiva. As Jiva, I am expressing this individual, this particular Jiva is expressing through the BMI. So my thoughts and my actions. Now, yes, if I am contaminated by selfishness, then I become a limited individual, confined to the BMI. But the moment I grow out of my selfishness, I start expanding towards that infinitude. How much you expand determines how much successful you are in life. And therefore, effectively. So this is what, the practical purpose of understanding the Bhagavad-Gita should be like this, in which case you will always be able to expand, enrich, and contribute for the betterment of this world, which is also emanated from the infinite. So the picture of each one of us, centered in our physical BMI. So I am, really speaking, capable of infinite hearing. I can actually hear anything in this universe. even from the multi-universes. I can see everywhere. I can touch anything. I can taste anything. I can smell. I have the power. But currently, in this jiva, I am limited by the physical ear, the physical eye, the physical skin, and the physical tongue, and the physical nose. Therefore, limited hearing, limited sight, limited touch, limited taste, and limited smell. I get limited. I am stone mold, and I am limited. Out comes limited hearing, limited sight, limited touch, taste, and smell. This is what is happening. I hope the illustration is clear and it will strike your mind such that you will not forget in your life that this is how things work. Okay, so going ahead. Self makes us enjoy the pleasures of the senses by engaging the mind. Pleasures of the senses by engaging the mind. So that means there is a process that is happening which is called as the process of perception. That process of perception deceives us into believing that the senses and the mind is the owner and not the self. Those who identify the knowledge of the self are not deluded. Thus, if you are confident about the self or of the knowledge of the self, you have really understood the concept of the self, then you will not be deluded. And you will be the wise one who sees the process correctly. You will understand that it is the self that is enlivening my senses and the mind. We understand, we can really connect with that knowledge of the self. And we can see the mind and senses as a tool that is being activated by that power of the self. And then we will see that power of the self getting transformed into metabolic powers within us. First, it becomes a metabolic power because we draw in the forces of nature to oxygenation, hydration, food, and other kinds of nutrients, metabolism, and then digestion and metabolism, and then it is what gives us energy of the mind, the memory, the knowledge, etc., and reasoning capability. And that which then connects with the knowledge outside. So that knowledge itself is also everything, infinite. That knowledge is also self. So it connects with that self which is knowledge, the subject, the originator, and the knowledge. This is how each one of us is really, if you understand this, then you will start understanding the knowledge of the self. In another slightly detailed picture, if you look at it, you can see the Brahman, the infinitude, becoming the universal forces on the left side of the pane, becoming the Atman within us, becoming the Jiva entangled with the BMI as consciousness. So it becomes consciousness now within each one of us, which is contaminated prajna, which gives us as existence as a Jiva, individual entity, which also gives us the opportunity to acquire and understand knowledge, and also gives us the power to derive happiness from the senses and the mind, and even from higher order thinking. Through the powers of the ego and the intellect, ideas, decisions, and judgment, and therefore I say I exist, I know, I am happy, etc. And the mind, the emotions that are derived, emotions actually form the mind. The flow of emotions form the mind. Emotions, feelings, doubts, and indecisions form the mind. And the senses and body are driven by this knowledge and indecisions and emotions, etc., giving sensations and our actions. So you can see how the whole thing works. So before the intellect and mind comes into picture, there is what is called as prajna. At the top, you can see that blue line. And when it starts working through this BMIs, the intellect first, the mind and the body, the intellect and the mind within that world of thinking, thoughts, is called as Taijasa, which is the power which the Tejas, the light behind all our thoughts and actions. So Tejasa. And it becomes the power to act in this world, to create our world, therefore it is the Vishwa. The consciousness transforming now from Tejasa, Prajna to Tejasa to Vishwa. That is how that consciousness now gets differentiated. So this is all Upanishad knowledge. I'm just connecting this with respect to this knowledge here, and therefore I have placed the slide here. That's all. Now, this we have discussed previously also, so some of you may actually trigger these thoughts. But otherwise, just for the sake of knowledge, I have shown you here. So it is about the self, empowering the ego for initially and the intellect, which controls our memories and all the actions or the thoughts, which is about, our jnanendriyas, hearing, sensing, tasting, seeing, and smelling. And also the Pancha Pranas within us, the life forces, Prana, Apana, Vyana, Udhana, and the Samana. And then ultimately working through the body, the Panchabhutas, earth, water, fire, air, and space, the body. Energizing the, karmendriyas, speech, hand, leg, anus, genitals, mouth, grasp, all these indriyas. This is what we all are. So if you look at the, we talk about in the medical field, they study anatomy, and psychologists also study the human psychological anatomy, etc. But here is the spiritual anatomy, the Vedanta anatomy that is elaborated thousands of years back. This is what we all are. And they picturized, they superimposed a graphical notion on this, top of this, graphical picture and on top of it. And that graphical notation is what this is. What is this thing here? Sorry. Superimposition of that graphics. The first, the life force, which is our thoughts, driving our actions, and the picture. The picture is about the self actually going into all our thoughts and actions, and it has to infiltrate, it has to come down. That self has to come down to every thought and every action, to kill the ego first, to subdue our extreme emotions, and to restrain our pleasure habits, and to identify with the self. And that picture is what the Bhagavad-Gita's picture is all about. The self actually coming down into our heart, Krishna in the middle. And of course, Arjuna sitting at the back and be controlled by the 5 horses, the senses. That is the picturization of the whole of Bhagavad Gita. And this is what is being explained through all these details, through all these chapters so far. That is Bhagavad Gita's picturization in the Mahabharata field of action. Karma, Kshetra, Karma Kshetre, Kurukshetre. Karma Kshetra, the field of action, the field of doing things. Karma Kshetre, Kurukshetre. So now is basically what the final verses describing the hierarchical classification of the power of self. The self is seen as to the individual beings, intellect, mind, and body, empowered by the immutable Atman. Atman is immutable, and that Atman, when it is energizing the intellect, mind, and the body, therefore gets entangled with the nature, Sattva, Tamo gunas, and becomes a perishable jiva. But the body goes, the jiva is no more there. That is why it is perishable. And compared to the jiva, Atman is imperishable, immutable. Like that, so many of us are there, all intertwined and interconnected in this world. The immutable Atman is the same, actually linking all of us. But the jivas are different because of the nature of the intellect, mind, and the body. This is the picture. And these are the 2 levels, one perishable and the other imperishable. But what Gita has been telling us, Bhagavad-Gita has been telling us, is that there is something beyond this. And that something beyond this is the Ishvara. It is the combined prajnas of all the individuals living in this world together forms the Ishvara, which is supporting us through Jagrat, Swapna, and Sushupti. In all the states of our consciousness, that power is there. Whether it is in, when it is in the Jagrat Avastha, we actually differentiate so many of our powers of consciousness. When it is in the Swapna Avastha, we live only in the world of our thoughts. I mean, thoughts in the sense of impressions of thoughts. But even that is gone when it is in the deep sleep state. In the deep sleep state, we are actually still living entity Jiva. But that consciousness which is supporting us is actually the Ishvara. That is the Paramatma Ishvara. In that state, we are closest to that we are to Paramatma is when we are in the deep sleep state, which is when we are not connected to any of our senses and the mind. Much above all of this is basically what the infinite Brahman is. And that is what is called as the perfect personality. Purushottama. That is Purushottama. The Brahman is the Purushottama. Ishvara is, what actually supports all of us in deep sleep state, in Jagrad and the Swapnavasthas, everywhere. In all of us, that is the same power, which is the Ishvara. And when we are in the Swapna state, we start becoming individuals. And in Jagrad state, we are truly an individual exhibiting in this world through our mind and intellect. So we have the individual that is supported by the universal Ishvara, and that is all coming from the infinite. This is the hierarchy. And this is the concept that we will see in every aspect of our life and living. Human thinking that is rooted in Yajna, Tyaga, Samarpana, Prasada Bhavas is the path of evolution for each one of us. These bhavas, where does these bhavas come from? These bhavas come from the infinity, because Brahman is rooted in this. Is what Bhagavad-Gita itself has declared in chapter 3. So what is Brahman? Brahman is sacrifice. What is sacrifice? Sacrifice is Yajna Bhava. What is Yajna Bhava? That is what, Yajna, Tyaga, Samarpana, Prasada Bhavas, more differentiated for us to understand. Because if you simply say, Yajna, I am Yajna, then you will ask what Yajna is. Yajna is about cooperation, sacrifice, dedication, and abundance. So, further differentiation, if you want to really understand what Yajna is, you should know what cooperation is, you should know what dedication is, you should know what Tyaga, sacrifice is, and you should also know what positivity is, abundance is. If you understand all four aspects of this, and then bring about all the four aspects into your thoughts and living, then you can say that you are actually becoming a Yajna Swarupa. So, saying that you should be Yajna Swarupa is all very spiritually and, entertaining. But how do you actually live in this world in Yajna Bhava? That is when you need to understand what Yajna Bhava is. So, the simplest way in which you can really understand is through Karma Yoga, which is about cooperation, dedication, sacrifice, and abundance, positivity. So, if you can, now we know more in concrete terms how actually you can live Yajna Bhava. Human aspirations, thoughts, and actions rooted in the bhavas. That bhavas also are for this world only. Without this mind and body, those bhavas do not have any meaning. Isn't it? Cooperation. If without the mind, what is cooperation? Nothing. The principles of coexistence and expansion that forms the underlying basis of these bhavas make for sustainable universe. So, abstracting that. And then the infinite that is beyond all these things. These are the three states of what is called as the power of the self. So that is basically what the conclusion of the whole of Bhagavad-Gita is, that it is to be living in this world with the right attitudes, supreme motivations, and developing and integrating the attitudes with a sense of detachment, renunciation, without looking at the results, engage in your action. Without looking at the results, engage in actions in a proactive manner. That is the conclusion that Bhagavad-Gita is giving us. The paths to perfection. I am trying to compare that with the first diagram that we also looked at. So, you can, for example, taking initiatives is one example that I am depicting here. At an individual level, you can work, doing things for the benefit of oneself, to outsmart others, to gain prominence and power. If you start doing things to enjoy the benefits for yourself, or to actually outsmart others and become more prominent and powerful, that is at the individual level you are employing these capabilities, which is selfish. But you can slowly rise to a better level, which is to take teams and organization into better heights. Instead of only me, the team and organization is also in my view now, to benefit my team, colleagues, and the organization, or the product or the project that I am working on, and to create an enduring value to the organization. That is a little bit more global. It becomes global. Much more than that is the highest level of power that we can invoke, which is to take, to do things for the sake of knowledge, for the sake of a process to perfection, to advance knowledge, to uplift, enhance the human beings, all the beings around us and environment. Higher goals, not just the organization only, but for higher goals. That is the infinitude that we can achieve or bring about in this life. So from individual, start looking at globalizing your attitudes and actions, and then start thinking much more higher to value systems, higher value systems. That is the evolution to perfection that the Gita is practically telling us to live in this world. That is the secret knowledge in terms of practically living in this world. So that is what the path of life has several choices for us. And that path of life and the choices have to be taken rightly is what Gita advocates, Bhagavad-Gita advocates. The initial choice is about the path of the good versus the path of the pleasant. First choice is path of good or path of pleasant. If I take the path of pleasant, I go southward, down to mediocrity. Because this path of pleasure is driven by mamatvam, mana, moha, sangadosha, kama, and dvandabhava. I, my feelings, pride, delusion, bad company, lust, and likes and dislikes. The path of good, on the other hand, uses viveka, discriminative capabilities, so that you know what it is, and now again you are felt with a choice. What is it? Either the joys of the body, mind, and intellect. You can still use the path of good for your own personal benefits, joys of the body, mind, and intellect, or you can actually use it for the higher value systems driven by joys of the self. So if you are actually individually for your personal good, you are doing good. Then also, if you keep doing that only, then you will become only average or good, at best good. But instead, if we are able to choose the higher values, joys of the self, which is driven by nirmana moha, chitasanka dosha, adhyatma nitya, vinivartakama, dvandhair vimuktaha, sukha-dukkha, sajnaya, equality, etc., then you are talking about perfection, excellence, and stardom in whatever you are doing. So these are the three paths to which you can, and the three levels, also rank mediocre, or average and good, or perfect, excellent, and a star. So practical terms, the Gita is teaching us this. The path of life. Whether you should actually go down to the roots, to the bottom, pulled down by sensory attachments and pleasures, selfishness, or be driven by higher value systems, wisdom. And for that, what is required is basically what Bhagavad-Gita is teaching us. And this infographic here shows a picturesque way of doing, actually what the wisdom of Gita is trying to teach. So this is the essence of the Bhagavad-Gita in 20 verses in the Purushottama Yoga, the 15th chapter. We will conclude this with the prayers, and then we can discuss. Sorry. But before that, we'll also, as usual, in the recent weeks, we have been also chanting the Gita Arati. So let us do the Gita Arati and the concluding mantra, and then we will go for discussion.